Okay, what this course is about, let me say very quickly, is discussion of the character of the social forms of society in Eastern Europe, and particularly the character of the revolts which occurred in Eastern Europe in the period from the war to 1989. Now, the subject, I think, is quite interesting and exciting in itself, and it's quite important also for social theory, both from the point of view of trying to understand a seemingly different kind of society from our own, and also in terms of assessing the possibilities of the future of those societies, and also the future of our own society in relation to that. Now, one of the things which I think is very clear is that the experience of Eastern Europe, both in Eastern Europe and in the rest of, as people saw it in the rest of the world, blighted terms like socialism and communism in people's experience. And so what happened in Eastern Europe is not significant merely in itself, I think, but it's also significant for what people think about the past, the present, and the future of the idea of socialism. For example, if you look at what happened in Eastern Europe in 1989, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, in Germany, and so on, should we see this as the end of socialism, or should we see it as the end of a massive impediment to socialism? These sorts of political questions are ones which obviously are highly relevant in the context of the discussion of Eastern Europe. Now, I don't want to spend time simply discussing the form of society in Eastern Europe. It seems to me that the movements, popular movements at different points in different countries in Eastern Europe, are at least as interesting as that question, and actually potentially more interesting. Some of the most impressive social movements in Europe since the war occurred in Eastern Europe. The Hungarian Revolution in 1956, for example, or the Solidarity movement in Poland, 1980 to 1981. And those movements are full of ideas. They developed all kinds of new ideas and new kinds of organisation and new kinds of practices whose potential, in my view, has not been fully explored. And so I'm going in part to, not this week, but later on, to be focusing on these movements and the way that they arose out of and they related to various kinds of crisis tendencies inside the countries of Eastern Europe, inside the East Europe, what we might call the East European system. And most of the materials I'm going to talk about are born from 3 countries, rather than trying to cover everything. I'm going particularly to be focusing on Poland, on Hungary, and on Czechoslovakia. Because in many ways, the choice of those is they're the more advanced, economically advanced of the countries, and more importantly, that's where some of the most interesting developments occur. Now, let me go straight on then to talk about the birth of the system in Eastern Europe. I may not manage to finish it then, and I'll have to carry on next week with this. Now, just in terms of what to, you'll be wondering what all that huge bibliography to read. There are 3 key books, I think, which are all listed on the first page of that reading list. Of course, there's no chalk, so I'll just have to tell you what they are. There's 2 of them are available easily. One of them is desperately unavailable, I'm afraid. But one of them is, the 2 easily available ones are the book by Colin, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Claudin, anyway. That's full of information and material. Claudin's book, The Communist Movement from Common Turn to Common Form, which is written by a member of the Spanish Communist Party. And Gabriel Kolko's book, The Politics, I'll give it to you afterwards. And Kolko's book, The Politics of War. Additionally, if you can possibly find a copy, if you ever see one in the second-hand bookshop, I'll buy it from you. The book by Gluckstein, Stalin Satellites in Eastern Europe, which was published in the early 1950s, and unfortunately is not in the library, but it is jammed full of information. Now, what sort of states and what sort of societies are we talking about? If we look at them in the period when they were being reformed at the end of the Second World War, then I think there are a number of things which stand out about all of them. The first thing is that all of them, historically, were relatively new states or nations. All of them, all the countries that we know of as the countries of Eastern Europe, were formed, really, after the First World War, as independent states. After the First World War, they were carved out of the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1918, 1919, that's when their borders were broadly drawn up and so on. Mostly, the second thing is that mostly these were the backward and agrarian parts of Europe. For example, in 1931, in Poland, only 27% of the population of Poland lived in towns. It's a, compare it with England or France or Germany, it's a much more backward, much more agrarian rural society. The level of agricultural productivity in Eastern Europe was much lower than it was in Western Europe. These are peasant societies, predominantly, much poorer, much more backward. The level of agricultural productivity 4 to 5 times lower than in Western Europe. The one exception to this is Czechoslovakia, which is a much more advanced, industrialized country, even in the interwar period. The third thing about these countries is that, again, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, if you look at those countries between the wars, then, largely speaking, we're not talking about democratic countries. The government is characterized by one writer as being one of ineffectual authoritarianism. Not untypical was the government of Poland in the 1930s, which was a government of colonels. Parliamentary democracy not really established itself in Eastern Europe. Military and semi-military, right-wing, not particularly effective governments. As I say, the one exception was Czechoslovakia, which enjoyed the parliamentary democratic system from 1918 through to 1939, when the Germans, the Nazis took over. What this means is that these were countries which undoubtedly experienced a very considerable need for industrialization in order to absorb a very large surplus population in the countryside, in order to develop a market for their agricultural output, and so on. So all the reasons why any part of the world needs industrialization certainly applied to Eastern Europe. But you have to say that in the interwar years they were very unsuccessful in terms of economic development and industrialization. The local capitalist classes were relatively weak, politically and economically. Most of the pattern of industrialization in Eastern European countries between the wars was dominated by foreign capital. For example, in Poland in 1937, 40% of the capital of companies belonged to foreign companies. This was by no means untypical. They were, if you like, in economic terms, if you like, semi-colonial countries. Half the bank credits came from... The other factor in this is that, rather like the picture in many third world and semi-peripheral countries in the post-war period, in the 1930s, there are two major economic actors in a sense. One is foreign capital, the other is the state. And in the 1930s, half the bank credits, for example, right across Eastern Europe, came from government banks. The state banking, quite an extensive nationalized sector in a whole number of these countries, in chemicals, in coal, in steel, and so on. Now, all of these countries experienced the crisis of the 1930s in a very severe form. It hit them much harder than it hit Britain, for example, or France. The agricultural prices collapsed in the world crisis. Of course, agricultural products were their main products, so their economies were very badly hit. They experienced a tremendous drop in exports. They experienced massive balance of payments crises, credit dried up, and so on. And the world crisis strengthened the tendency in the 1930s to state ownership. There was a further development of state ownership in a number of these countries in the 1930s. And also there was an increasing tendency for governments in the 1930s in these countries to talk about planning For example, the Hungarians adopted a 5-year plan in 1938. The Poles adopted a 4-year plan in 1938 as well. In Hungary, the key proponent of planning was the War Ministry. That's to say that planning was by no means in the 1930s associated in people's minds with the word socialism, nor was state ownership associated with the word socialism. It was associated with nationalism and with militarism. And all of these countries in the 1930s experienced a major rise in arms spending, and they were all of them, in a sense, guns or butter economies, or guns not butter economies, putting an emphasis on trying to build up their military strength in the growing political turmoil in Europe in the 1930s. In the end, they proved to be no match at all, however, for the German war machine, of course. Just an example, Poland was spending $2 per head in the late 1930s on producing aircraft. The Germans were producing $100, spending $100 a head on aircraft production, 50 times the level of expenditure. When it came to the test in 1939, the Poles were invaded by Germany. Their army and their air force were just wiped out by a much superior industrial war machine, which was run by the Nazis. I mention this thing about state ownership, however, and planning and the rest of it, because in some ways, of course, it's a prelude to what comes after the war, when there's a further development of state ownership and planning in Eastern Europe. These were by no means unfamiliar as ideas and forms of organisation already in the 1930s in the countries of Eastern Europe. Now, all these countries were devastated by the Second World War. The policy of the Germans in occupied Eastern Europe, both amongst those countries which they formally conquered and annexed, or those which formally allied themselves, like Hungary, for example, and Romania were allies of the Germans during the war. It really didn't make much difference in terms of what German policy was. The policy was to use Eastern Europe as an agricultural colony. As Hitler put it, what India was for England, the eastern lands will be for us. The general background to this policy of the Germans in the 1930s, of course, and in the 1940s, this policy of seeking to create a colonial space for themselves in Europe. In Hitler's dreams, it would extend, of course, as far as the Urals and beyond, although he never quite got to the boundaries he intended. The general background was that Hitler was seeking to create an autarkic empire in Europe to match and parallel, in a sense, the British Empire and the American Empire, and so on. The whole process of economic development in the world in the 1930s had been towards the formation of closed trading blocks, each of them sealing itself off more and more with tariffs and so on from the others. The pattern of world trade was one in which trade declined even faster than production declined in the 1930s. The Americans established their tariffs in 1930. The British established their colonial preference system, imperial preference system, also in the early 1930s. The French did the same. The Japanese were seeking in Eastern Asia to set up what they called their co-prosperity sphere, in other words, the Japanese Empire, and so on. All the existing planning mechanisms and state industries were taken over by the Germans when they occupied. Jewish properties, of course, state properties, and also all Jewish properties became Germanized, and most foreign capital was also taken over by the Germans. The result was that when you come to the end of the war, it was very easy for the new governments which came into place after the war to take over property. It was already largely state-controlled or Germanized. There was a tremendous basis already laid, in a sense, during the war, even through the very process of devastation, for the establishment of very extensive state ownership at the end of the war. What happened during the war was that what was already a low level of agricultural production collapsed even further. And the populations of these countries were was devastating. Poland lost 6 million people in the process of the Second World War, which is equivalent to 22% of its population, wiped out in the 6 years from 1939 to 1945. In Yugoslavia, 1.7 million people were killed. In Romania, more than 500,000. The Poles and the Yugoslavs lost half their livestock, either killed or looted by the... Sorry? 1.7 million. I mean, I wouldn't worry about the exact figures. The general point about the devastation of the populations and so on is the key thing. Industry in these European countries was wrecked and looted. In Poland, 30% of the houses and the buildings were destroyed by the end of the war, and if you looked at the city of Warsaw, 93% of the buildings were destroyed. Because at the end of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, Hitler ordered that the city of Warsaw should be razed to the ground as an act of revenge against the Warsaw Uprising. In Hungary, most of the factories were damaged and many of them were destroyed. So Eastern Europe at the end of the war has been already a backward area, has been thrown much further backwards. The populations are experiencing mass poverty. There's a tremendous, for a brief period after the war, there was a tremendous process of United Nations relief, basic food aid for Eastern Europe, which lasted for about a year. Because the population, many of the people of Eastern Europe were experiencing starvation. It was said that in Romania, the level of infant mortality in 1945 was 80%. 4 out of every 5 babies were dying in the first year. Such was the level of impoverishment and starvation. The other crucial thing, of course, about the formation of the states of Eastern Europe is that all of them were liberated from German control by the armies of the USSR. And the USSR replaced Germany as the dominant power in the region at the end of the war. And clearly the fate of Eastern Europe was shaped by the character of the Russian state and the Russian state's interests in Eastern Europe. Those who ruled Russia had a very definite view of what their interests in Eastern Europe were, and they were to impose this view of their interests on Eastern Europe. So we need to understand what the interests of the Russian state were, to understand the form that the liberation of Eastern Europe took, in order to see how these states were created and how their relationships developed with major powers in the world. Now, it's interesting to explore at this point the relationship between Marxist theory and the practice of the USSR. Because I suppose one of the classic places for looking for Marxist theory in practice was in relation to such questions as were faced the USSR at the end of the war, would be the practice and the theory of the Bolsheviks in the face of the First World War. See, the First World War was denounced by the Bolsheviks as an imperialist struggle for spheres of influence, and it was always analysed by them in class terms. At the end of the war, they denounced and opposed the policy of the victorious Allies of imposing reparations on Germany, saying, why should the German workers pay for the crimes of their bosses? They sought to the Bolshevik policy was to seek to turn the turmoil of the First World War into revolution. Now, having said that, that's fairly clear and understandable. Stalin, on every point, acts completely differently. Of course, Stalin's regime in Russia was not Lenin's regime of 1917. The regime in Russia had, in the course of the 1920s and particularly in the 1930s, destroyed the remnants of the 1917 revolution and its leadership. Remember, by 1940, nobody from the 1917 leadership survived, except Stalin. Most of those who led the Russian Revolution in 1917 had been executed. And the regime in Russia rested on the intense exploitation of the workers and the peasants in Russia. And the domestic politics of Russia were reflected in its foreign policy. There's always a connection between the domestic and the foreign policies of countries. It's very well discussed, for example, in the book which I referred to, Colin's book. See, the regime in Russia was afraid of revolution. A popular revolution elsewhere. After all, popular revolution elsewhere could infect the population of the USSR. From the 1930s, it was part of the policy. And if you look at the histories of foreign policy of the USSR in the 1930s, it was a policy to develop their own state power and to maneuver to the degree it was possible amongst the other rival imperialist powers to seek accommodations and alliances as a protection, to form a protective shield of alliances, maneuvering amongst the rivalries, amongst the major powers, to seek protection for the USSR. And the local communist parties were really called in a sense, in different parts of the world, to play a supporting role in this overall strategy. And it became the policy of the local communist parties to oppose socialist revolutions or attempts at socialist revolution, for example in France in 1936, during the role of the Communist Party in the Spanish Civil War and so on. If you like, the climax of this policy comes in 1939, when Stalin, to the horror of many communists in different parts of the world, actually signs a pact of non-aggression with Hitler, the famous Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. When, as a result of that pact, partly as a result of that pact, Hitler marched into Poland in September 1939 from the west, several weeks later, Stalin's armies moved into eastern Poland, and Poland was divided between Germany and the USSR. Similarly, Stalin took over the Baltic states, the issues which are currently in the newspapers, about the independence of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, date back to 1940, when the Baltic states were absorbed by force into the USSR. It's true they held the referendum in these countries, but the referendum was fixed. The results in one of the, I think it was in Latvia, the results of the referendum were published the day before it was held. 99% of the population voted in favour. However, the elections being put off because of bad weather. The results were published in the Russian newspapers before they were held. 1.5 million Poles were deported from Poland to Siberia, many thousands of them dying in the process of being transported to Siberian labour camps. What was revealed about the social character of the USSR by the end of the 1930s in its behaviour in Poland and in the Baltic states was that Russia was a perfectly conventional imperialist power. However, it was different from the other imperialist powers in that it was a relatively weak one. Nonetheless, it was an imperialist power. Now, once, of course, Germany invaded Russia in 1941, Russia became an ally of the United States and the British in the war against Germany. And the war was fought not in class terms, but in highly national patriotic terms. And much of the popular propaganda imitated the sorts of language which today you will find in the Sun newspaper. This is a Russian writer, Ilya Ehrenberg, who for some reason has considerable reputation in the 1950s and 1960s as a liberal, writing in Pravda on the 24th of July 1942. Quote, this was widely published all over the place, this article by the great writer Ilya Ehrenberg. We do not want to talk, we do not want to be indignant, we want to kill. If you have not killed at least one German in the course of a day, the day has been in vain. If you have killed one German, kill a second. There is for us nothing more beautiful than German corpses. Do not count the miles. Count only the Germans you have killed. Kill the Germans, your old mother begs you. Kill the Germans, your children implore you. Kill the Germans, your native soil cries out. Kill. Not exactly the conventional language of communism in relation to war, as people have understood it previously. The World War II meetings between the leaders, between Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, show the pattern of discussion between the states and their leaders to be like the pattern of discussion which occurred during the First World War amongst the Allies. What they were concerned with was the carving up of the world after the war. And imperialist interests were primary. Churchill, in his memoirs, has a fascinating account of his meeting with Stalin in Moscow in 1944, which gives you a flavour of the thing, because it's about Eastern Europe. Churchill writes as follows: "The moment was apt for business." He's gone to Moscow, he's sitting down with Stalin in negotiation. "The moment was apt for business. So I said, let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. Your armies are in Romania and Bulgaria. We have missions and agents there too. Don't let us get at cross purposes in small ways. So far as Britain and Russia are concerned, how would it be for you to have 90% predominance in Romania, for us to have 90% of the say in Greece, and go 50-50 about Yugoslavia?" While this was being translated, I wrote on a half sheet of paper: Romania, Russia 90%, the others 10%. Greece, Great Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50. Hungary 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, the others 25%. I pushed this across to Stalin, who had by then heard the translation. There was a slight pause. Then he took his pencil and made a large tick upon it and passed it back to us. It was all settled in no more time than it takes to set down. After this there was a long silence. The penciled paper lay on the centre of the table. At length I said, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues, so fateful to millions of people, in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper." "No, you keep it," said Stalin. Now, in practice, because of the interest of the British Empire and the relative weakness of the British Empire, it was possible for Stalin to come to an agreement with Churchill on such matters much more easily than it was possible to come to an agreement with the United States. The British were interested in recreating after the war a world of spheres of interest. After all, they had a massive sphere of interest called the British Empire, which they wanted to protect. They were willing to come to deals with other powers about the formation of a world of blocks again. The United States was so dominant in the world that its interest after the war, particularly after the experience of crisis in the 1930s, was that it wanted to turn the whole world into its block. That's called the policy of free trade. It wanted an open door everywhere, and in the long run, that of course was to bring it into massive conflict with the USSR, because their aims became completely opposed right across the globe. The implications of this sphere of interest policy are important. Stalin wanted his allies, the British and the Americans and so on, to give him a hands-off policy as far as Eastern Europe was concerned. And in return, he was willing to agree to hands-off in what he would agree would be the spheres of interest of the other powers. And this was a policy which was pursued, not simply by Stalin himself, but it was urged upon other parties in different parts of the world. For example, in India, the Indian Communist Party took a position well to the right of the Indian Congress Party. The Indian Congress Party wanted to fight for independence and said, we're only prepared to support the British in the war if we're guaranteed that at the end of the war we get our independence. The Indian Communist Party laid down no such conditions and said, what matters is to fight for Germany. In Italy and in France at the end of the war, the Communist parties proposed and pursued a policy of disarming the resistance, of collaborating in the formation of the new governments, taking minority parts in coalition governments. In France, for example, the Communist Party leadership took the part of the Ministry of Labour and went around stopping strikes. In Greece, the British attacked. There was an attempt at a revolution in Greece at the end of the war, and the British RAF was sent in from 1944 to bomb the Greeks into submission. And Churchill remarked that he was very much obliged to Marshal Stalin for not having taken too great an interest in Greek affairs. And in fact, Stalin was urging the Communist Party of Greece to come to an agreement with its opponents. In Britain, just as I mean, the British Communist Party was a pretty small party and an ineffective party, but in Britain in 1945 in the election, the British Communist Party took the position to the right of the Labour Party. The Labour Party said Labour must win the election. The Communist Party called for a coalition government of Labour and progressive Tories like Anthony Eden. In China, well, in Yugoslavia, and of course in China, the advice from Moscow was that there ought not to be communist revolutions. At the end of the war, in other words, it was by no means the policy of the Russians to establish what they called socialism in Eastern Europe. In relation to Poland, for example, Stalin declared that an attempt to create socialism in Poland would be like trying to put a saddle on a cow. The programs which were issued by the communist parties of the different East European countries at the end of the war opposed nationalisation rather than proposing nationalisation. The only nationalisation that they suggested was appropriate was the nationalisation of former German assets. It was the socialist parties, if anything, which were more left-wing than the communist parties in the period immediately after the war in Eastern Europe. You know, the equivalence of the Labour Party in Britain. What their interest was in doing was creating a buffer zone of friendly states which would certainly not be hostile to the USSR, but a buffer zone of friendly states with coalition governments in which the communist parties would play a minority role. Although the communist parties would also expect to play a strategic role in those governments, and they had the power to insist that they would get a strategic role in those governments because, of course, the Red Army was there in place and able to enforce its will. But Eastern Europe was to be treated, after the war, as far as the Russians were concerned, as a zone for Russian exploitation. And I'll document this in a minute. Now, such a policy required that any domestic processes of popular revolution should be contained. Not that they should be encouraged, but that local revolutionary movements in the different countries in Eastern Europe should be contained, prevented. And this was the role which the Red Army and the local communist parties played in the period at the end of the war. For example, we'll start, as the Red Army moves across country by country, Bulgaria, which is the first to fall. The regime in Bulgaria, the fall of the regime, was greeted in 1944 with great enthusiasm by the workers of Bulgaria. There were mass arrests of the ex-fascists. Elected people's tribunals were created. The police were disarmed by the population. The workers' militia was established in Sofia. Democratic local governments were elected. There were red flags everywhere. In the army, there were soldiers' councils were created, and there was soldiers degraded their officers, ripping off their badges of office and so on. Very encouraging, you might think, sort of process for communists. See these sorts of things going on. Workers moving into action, soldiers degrading their officers, popular democratic bodies being created, red flags everywhere. The Red Army stopped it. Marshal Tubolkin had, one commentator put it, no patience with Balkan repetitions of 1917. The soldiers' committees were banned, and a government was imposed on Bulgaria called the Fatherland Front. A government under a man called Georgiev. Who was this Georgiev? He was an extreme right-winger who'd been the author of the massacre of 1923 of peasants and of the military coup of 1934. The Minister of Agriculture was a member of the Communist Party, a man called Yugov, who said we had no intention of introducing communism. In Romania, the Communist Party supported the monarchy of King Peter. There was a coalition government set up, which included a man called Tatarescu, who'd led the murder of 11,000 peasants in 1907, and who was pro-Hitler, and who'd switched allegiance at the last minute, and along with the whole of the rest of the Romanian government, and changed sides at the last minute. He was in the government. The Minister of War in the new government had the Iron Cross, which presumably he politely kept in a drawer, but he'd actually been awarded the highest military honour by Hitler's armies. In Hungary, rather similar sort of process. Imre Nagy, who was later to be an important figure in the events of the 1956 revolution, a leading member of the Communist Party, spoke against any attempt to introduce socialism in Hungary. The factories and the mines in Hungary were restored to their former owners. As Kolko puts it, the government considered left socialism the greatest danger. In Poland, the process of the liberation of Poland was slightly more complex. In summer of 1944, as the Red Army was coming in through the east of Poland, the people of Warsaw, on the 1st of August, rose up in the Warsaw Uprising against the Germans who were still holding Warsaw. They were encouraged to do so by broadcasts from Moscow, which urged them to take up arms against the Nazis and help to drive them out. However, just as the uprising began, the Russian army experienced a series of military defeats and was driven back by a German push, some dozens of miles, and was no longer immediately able to give direct military aid to the Warsaw insurgents. And there's no question, I mean, some people have said, there are Polish nationalists who say that the Red Army sat on the borders of Warsaw waiting for the Warsaw Uprising to be defeated before they moved in. That's militarily incorrect. I mean, from all the histories I've managed to read, it does seem that they genuinely were driven back for a period. The Warsaw Uprising lasted for 2.5 months, and in the process 240,000 people were killed, 250,000 people were killed in one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest attempt at an uprising against the Nazis during the war. What was the role of the Red Army in this? Certainly they were not in a position to advance. They can't be accused on that score. However, they were in a position to supply arms by air to the Warsaw insurgents, and they didn't. They were in a position to clear the skies over Warsaw with their aircraft, or to attempt to clear the skies over Warsaw with their aircraft to assist the insurgents who were being strafed by German bombers and machine guns. They didn't do so. When the Americans asked for permission from the Russians to fly from Britain to drop arms material, war guns and so on, ammunition, to the insurgents in Warsaw, they were refused permission to land beyond Warsaw to refuel to be able to fly back, which meant they couldn't fly these missions. The result was that 240,000 people were killed. A large part of the opposition that might have existed in Poland after the war had been decimated. In Czechoslovakia, it was workers' councils which seized the factories at the end of the war. Revolutionary guards were established, patterned a little bit like that in Bulgaria. The Communist Party Ministry of the Interior insisted that the workers' guards should be disarmed. The Communist Party opposed nationalization. A man called Zapotocki, of the Czech equivalent of the TUC, leading member of the Communist Party, declared, "We are going in the direction of state national capitalism. We must not suppose we are already building a socialist state." In Czechoslovakia, the position taken by the Social Democratic Party was more left-wing than the Communist Party. The workers' councils, which had been set up at the end of the war, were rapidly subordinated to the bureaucratic control of the Czech TUC. In Yugoslavia, of course, Stalin discouraged Tito's partisans from taking power. The former king of Yugoslavia was supported by Moscow longer than he was by the British and the Americans. Stalin told Tito that his partisans really ought not to wear red stars on their uniforms. Red stars are, he said, too much. Of course, Stalin was unable to prevent the revolution in Yugoslavia, but it wasn't his intention or his hope that there would be one. The same pattern, of course, that was to be repeated several years later in China, when almost to the last minute the advice of Moscow to the Chinese communists was not to proceed with their revolution. So there's generally the policy of Moscow, which of course has got a great deal of muscle behind it in the shape of the Red Army, is fundamentally a conservative one. And it's paralleled in Western Europe, as I mentioned, where in Italy and France, the communists entered the coalition governments and took on the job of containing working class protest. This is in the period 1945 and a couple of years afterwards. It changes in a couple of years, but the immediate period at the end of the war is one in which conservative containment is the predominant policy. A couple of other things are notable, I think, because they become significant for the future. One is that, in general, Moscow had a preference in each country for particular sorts of communists, because communists were not by any means, the leaders of the communist parties were by no means homogeneous. Some communists had stayed in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or wherever during the war and tried to organize a resistance to the Nazis. Others had been in Moscow. The ones who were preferred were the Moscow ones. The Muscovites, as they were called, were generally preferred by Moscow to the local ones. The second thing, which I think is worth noting about the policy of containment, was that there was a policy in several countries of diverting social demand or popular demands for social advance, particularly in Czechoslovakia and Poland, diverting these away from social questions towards national questions, particularly towards anti-Germanism and anti-Hungarianism. In Poland, more than 5 million Germans were deported from Poland across the border into what, until fairly recently, was becoming East Germany, with the help of the British Army. There was a massive process of deportation. One of the great population movements in Europe occurs at the end of the war in the form of massive forced deportations of populations. The empty lands of to the west of Poland were seized and incorporated into Poland, which meant, of course, that there was now enormous degree of new land and highly productive land, the better land actually, was now available for the westward movement of Poland's borders. The eastern borders, meanwhile, were moved to the west. Russia took a part of what had formerly been Poland and gave Poland part of what had formerly been Germany. If you look at the map, you'll see that Poland moved bodily to the west. In Czechoslovakia, 2.25 million Germans and 600,000 Hungarians were deported from Germany, from Czechoslovakia. The Czech Communist Party Ministry of Information declared in 1945, talking about one town, "We will clear Liberec of the German enemies, and we will do it so thoroughly that there will remain not the smallest place where the German seed could grow once more. We shall expel all the Germans, we shall confiscate their property, we shall de-Germanize not only the town but the whole area, so that the victorious spirit of Slavdom shall permeate the country from the frontier ranges to the interior." The policy is a tremendously nationalistic one, not a class policy, workers against employers, but Czechs against Hungarians and above all against Germans. Slavdom is the slogan. The Communist Party Manifesto in 1946 in Czechoslovakia declared, "We propagate the most beautiful thought, the new Slavism. The Slav states are today the most progressive in Europe." A nationalistic policy. In Poland and in Yugoslavia, in fact, it was communist ministers who took special responsibility for organising the deportations, very often in conditions of exceptional terror. There was certainly no attempt to emulate the policies of the Bolsheviks at the end of the First World War, calling on workers, regardless of nation and so on, to unite against the oppressors and the rest of it. This is posing not in class terms at all, but in national terms. And the governments called on the workers for, governments always call on the workers for, to quote the Czech Communist Manifesto of 1946, what do they want from the workers? Quote, "More and more work, more and more effort, more and more sweat." Sounds like it. Polytechnic then. Now, there are several stages in the political development, the development of internal politics. In the first stage, as I was describing, coalition governments are set up. And within them, the Communist Party set about monopolizing control. See, in most of these countries, there's one exception. Czechoslovakia was a country which always had a fairly substantial Communist Party. In most of these countries, the Communist Party was tiny. In Czechoslovakia, it always maintained a significant presence, even during the darkest days of Nazism. But outside the Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party was tiny and had very, very small support. In the Hungarian elections in 1945, the Communist Party, these were the only really effectively free elections that occurred in Hungary. The Communist Party got 17% of the vote, and the Smallholders Party, a peasant party to all intents and purposes, for all the contradictions implied in the term peasant party, the Smallholders Party got 57%. What the Communist parties always did in the coalition governments was to insist that they took over the Interior Ministry, like the foreign equivalent of the Home Office, the ministry in charge of internal security, the police, the prison system. And, of course, through the Russian army, they took control of the military. They then proceeded, by various sorts of processes, to eliminate the influence of the most popular parties, which very often were the peasant parties. And they used a mixture of methods. They eliminated as it were, the non-socialist parties gradually. And they used a mixture of methods, mostly methods which we could describe as police methods. They arrested the leaders of the party. They terrorized people into submission. They fixed the elections. In Poland in 1947, for example, tens of thousands of peasant party activists were arrested the night before the election and were released after the election was over. The peasant party was denied the right to have scrutineers at the polls, and in the polling stations. In most places they were excluded and they lost. In the few places where they managed to have scrutineers, they won. And finally, after really they decimated the peasant parties. There's a description of this by Rákosi, who was to become the leader of the Hungarian party. He described what he called the salami tactics, which they had used. In those days, he said, we used, recalling the experience later in the early 1950s, he said, in those days we used salami tactics, whereby we sliced off bit by bit reaction in the smallholders party. We whittled away the strength of the enemy. How did he do it? Well, it consisted, for example, of arresting one of the leaders of the smallholders party, a man called Bela Kovac, and deporting him to Russia for 9 years. In another case, a man called Ferenc Nagy, who was abroad, they frightened him into never coming back by holding his small son as a hostage, and so on. The key thing was that they had control of the police. As Rákosi again said, the Communist Party, he said, took absolute control of the political police, the AVO. It was the only institution of which we kept total control for ourselves. We firmly refused to share it with the other parties in the coalition in proportion to their respective strengths. The first stage was really that, having set up coalition governments, they then moved to monopolize control, to undercut by police method, rather than by a straightforward political campaign, the strength and the organization of their opponents, the significant opponents in the shape of the peasant parties. At the same time, it has to be said that the communist parties were growing very, very fast. They did recruit a new social base for themselves, and the growth was extremely rapid. In 3 months in 1945, for example, in Poland, the Polish party grew from 30,000 to 300,000 members, 10 times in 3 months. In Romania, they grew from 1,000 to hundreds of thousands. In Hungary, from 3,000 to 150,000. In Czechoslovakia, where, as I said, they were large at the beginning, they grew from 27,000 members to 1.16 million. Now, people joined for all sorts of reasons. I mean, there are writers who allege that people joined the Communist Party simply out of careerism. There were careerists who joined. But also, it's true, undoubtedly, that many workers and others were attracted to the Communist Party by the sense of riding on a wave of the future, a party that seemed to be associated with the idea of the anti-fascist struggle, a party that seemed to be associated with the idea of modernization, improvement, and so on and so on. Peasants who were given German and Hungarian land in Poland and Czechoslovakia were also attracted towards the Communist Party. The party had power, had growing prestige, and so on.